We are live, Mr. President.
Good afternoon, boa noite, buenas noches, bonsoir à tous. Today is the last international seminar for Muntú for the year, for this year, for 2021, not forever, only for this year, 2021. So we are pleased to have you with us as attendees, and we have a esteemed honor to receive today as a guest speaker, Dr. Thomas Edison. Dr. Thomas Edison is before I present him, I would like to say this. I will talk about his topic. I will say that in English, I will say that in Spanish, in Portuguese, and in French, the topic. Dr. Thomas will speak also slowly, right? For those who understand English, but they want to not go so fast on the pace of delivering of Dr. Edison. So after the presentation, we will have the question and answer, the Q&A. But before that, I will, before I talk about the topic, I will talk about the topic first, and then I will talk about who he is, and he will start. It will be about, today will be about African religion, spirituality in the Caribbean and Latin America, a culture of resistance. That means Dr. Thomas will talk about this culture of resistance, how that happened. And hoje, o palestrante vai falar da religião ou espiritualidade africana no Caribe e na Latinoamérica, uma cultura de resistencia. Hoy el doctor Thomas Edison hablará de la religión africana o de la espiritualidad africana en América Latina y en el Caribe, una cultura de resistencia. Aujourd'hui donc, Dr. Thomas Edison parlera de la religion africaine, la spiritualité africaine en Amérique latine et dans les Caraïbes, une culture de résistance. Avant qu'il ne commence sa présentation, before he starts his presentation, I would like to introduce Dr. Thomas Edison. It will be very short. Dr. Thomas Edison is a professor, associate professor of Spanish, so he speaks Spanish, at the University of Louisville. His main area of research is African Caribbean spirituality in the African Caribbean spirituality in Latin American narrative and cinema. Also, he has a very great book now. The book is Arche Aesthetic Literary Caribbean in Cuban, no literary Caribbean, literary in Cuban, Colombian, Costa Rican, and Panamanian novel of resistance. Without any further ado, Dr. Edison, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, my brother Clement. This is a wonderful honor. I'm very excited to be part of Muntú. And I'm going to explain that my perspective is that of an American that's using literature that's produced, and it's including an element that is very, very controversial for many North Americans. But before I get to that, I have to really acknowledge that part of my research has been as a result of the civil rights movement. In the 1960s, there were students that protested because they wanted the hiring of Black professors. They wanted the teaching of Pan-African-based courses. And as a result of that, we started to see that there's books and scholarly publications and conferences focusing on African elements. Before the 1960s, in those universities, the perspective was that of the white American. And as a result of the civil rights movement, we started to find scholars that worked in the field of Afro-Hispanic studies. I listed a few, but the list is much longer than this. And these scholars began to publish books. And we find that there's today a significant amount of research that helps us to recognize that Black cultures exist beyond the borders of the United States. And one of the ways that we as scholars and researchers and intellectuals are able to transmit this information is by professional conferences and organizations. And I've listed some very popular conferences that happen here in the United States that allow us to kind of connect with one another, to share our research. And I'm very excited to say that Muntú International Group is one of the newer ones, which is allowing us to connect, to be a unified group, because we need to kind of embrace each other. So that's my contextual introduction. The geographical region that I research on is the Caribbean. The reason why I picked the Caribbean is because, one, it's a defined area, and there are parallels between the countries in the Caribbean. And then I might use the word circum-Caribbean, which are those cultures that are not necessarily in the Caribbean, but they have the elements and the characteristics of the Caribbean. You might ask, well, what are some of those characteristics of the Afro-Caribbean region? Well, those communities have shared a similar psychic violence. And that's what Cornel West calls it, mental torture that people of African ancestry have had to endure. Frantz Fanon taps into internalized self-hatred because of the colonial infrastructure that forced people of African ancestry to deny themselves. There's a need for us to learn to embrace and love our culture, our skin, and our history. In the Caribbean region, there's the history of slavery, and the cuisine is similar. It's all been influenced by Africa, and then it adapts in different regions, but there's many similarities. And in the Caribbean basin, the Afro-Caribbean basin, there's been a series of cultural attacks of dance, language, music, and spiritual practices. The dates might be different and the languages might be different, but within all cultures, there have been times in which certain dances have been considered for the lower class and a scandal and maybe outlawed. Certain types of music was prohibited by certain groups because there was fear, especially music that had percussion. There was a fear that that might provoke slave revolts. Languages, especially African languages, were prohibited during the colonial period because of fear that the enslaved individuals might be planning a revolt. And my focus is spiritual practices. In the United States, there is a phenomenon which forces upward mobile, upper class men and women of African ancestry to deny African spiritual practices. They know about it, but if you are successful, you're supposed to deny that. And as a result of that, there are writers that have intentionally underscored African spiritual practices in their literature as a way to legitimize it and as a way to share with each other that African spirituality is legitimate and it is not something that should appear as a way to scare people. Usually if you see a movie or you read a book, when African spiritual practices appear, it's usually as a result of making people scared. But African spiritual practices are not what you see in the movies. Now, the theories that I use is one person I lean on a lot is Frantz Fanon. In his book, Black Skin, White Mask, he points out that the individual of Black ancestry has to work very hard to liberate himself or herself from the colonial mindset that is embedded within him. He makes the observation when the Negro makes contact with the white world, a certain sensitizing action takes place. If his psychic structure is weak, one observes a collapse of the ego. And Fanon talks about this from his own personal experience because he was raised thinking that he was French. And when he went from Martinica to France, he discovered that he was not French. He was Black. And it helped him to come up with the theory that you need to recognize that we are forced to put a mask on to see ourselves as being part of the dominant culture, but many times we are not accepted by the dominant culture. One important quote that Frantz Fanon makes is, quote, blacks are, quote, in a constant preoccupation with attracting the attention of the white man and being powerful like the white man. And that's one of the things that I noticed in the books that I've researched is that individuals of African ancestry adopt the behavior of the dominant culture. And as a result, they treat fellow Blacks the same way that they had been treated by whites. Another book by Frantz Fanon that I use in my research is from The Wretched of This Earth. And in this book, he talks about fighting literature. And for him, fighting literature is when the writer uses the text as a way to achieve social change. And he points out that there's 3 stages that the intellectual goes through. In the first stage, the individual, they adopt the structure that they are raised in. They would become educated within that culture and they play the game. In the second phase, they begin to become angry and they notice that there's something missing. And they start to move toward the third phase, and that is the fighting stage, in which they use their literature as a vehicle to wake up their brothers and sisters to see the reality that they are not able to see. And we're going to talk about double consciousness later, but these writers are able to help the reader to understand that there are walls that block us, but we don't always see those walls, because if you're raised within a culture, you accept things without understanding what they are. Now, one of the literary theorists that I use a lot is Richard Jackson. He has made an incredible contribution to Afro-Hispanic studies. And these are 4 of his most popular books. And he touches on the topic of authenticity. How to determine if a work is authentic. There's certain characteristics, and we'll talk about those in a minute, that help us to determine if a work is authentic or not. One of the writers that I will discuss is Manuel Zapata Olivella. And of the 4 writers, I think that Manuel Zapata Olivella, an Afro-Colombian intellectual, has done an incredible job helping to embrace Africa, African culture, African identity, to help individuals in the United States to understand that we are not detached from our African brothers and sisters. Now, there are intellectuals that played a significant role in helping to promote African identity, and that's the Negritude movement by 3 significant writers, Senghor, Césaire, and Damas. And they were getting people to think about identity, but they didn't get to the United States in terms of literature until the 1960s. They did influence one Cuban writer named Nicolás Guillen, who used his literature. He went through different phases. In the first phase, he did a movement called Negrista, in which you do caricatures of Blackness. But he evolved to Negritude, in which he started to use his poetry as a way to achieve a social change. And one of the people that he inspired is Nancy Morejon, who is also a part of that movement. A wonderful poet. She is not one of the people that I'm going to talk about today, but I love her to death. She's a friend of mine, so I have to acknowledge Nancy Morejon. Now, we talked about Frantz Fanon already. The double consciousness is really important because many times in the novels that we're going to discuss, there are characters or protagonists that do not understand the double consciousness. They don't understand that there is an unwritten rule of how things work. And it's very frustrating and very confusing until a person understands that if you are Black, there are certain things you have to be aware of and you have to accept. And then the third point, again, authentic Afro-Hispanic literature, according to Richard Jackson. The first writer that I am going to talk about is Alejo Carpentier. Alejo Carpentier was Swiss and German, but he was born in Cuba. His parents were Swiss and German. And in 1933, he wrote a book called Ekwe Yambo O. And it was what we would consider negrista. It was very superficial. It used stereotypes, especially animal imagery, to describe the characters. And it described them as being poor, but he didn't really put them in a context because he didn't really understand the Black community. After Ekweyambo O came out, he suffered a lot because some people felt that it was an insult that he would even consider writing about Blacks in Cuba, because it was thought that Blacks were not worthy of research or scholarship or representation. After 20 years, he wrote his best novel, El Reino de este Mundo, The Kingdom of This World. That novel really presented a concept that's really important, and that is lo real maravilloso, a way of looking at reality. The second novel is by Manuel Zapata Olivella, Chango el Gran Putas, Chango, the biggest badass. The third writer is Carlos Guillermo Wilson, who's Panamanian, Afro-Panamanian, and he wrote Los Nietos de Felicidad Dolores, which is a novel that focuses on the three groups or three linguistic groups of descendants of Africa: the French-speaking, English-speaking, and French-speaking. And the protagonist, Felicidad Dolores, is like a mother figure that she tries to get the groups to embrace one another, but there's challenges because each group feels like they're superior to the others. And the last work is by Afro-Costa Rican Quince Duncan. His novel is titled La Paz del Pueblo, Peace in the Town, and it is about a young man who comes to a small, poor town called Limon on the Atlantic coast of Costa Rica, and he is trying to motivate the workers that work in the banana industry to try to get them to understand that they're being manipulated, they're being taken advantage of, and he is challenged not only by the white population, but also by Blacks, because some Blacks have a vested interest in keeping quiet. Now, I'm only going to look at 3 characteristics today because there's 13 characteristics that I define as Ashe Caribbean elements. The first is lo real maravilloso, and some people confuse it with magical realism. They are 2 different concepts in my mind. Magical realism is a European concept, and it grew out of surrealism. Surrealism is irrational. It's unbelievable. It's fantastic. Well, when we look at painting, we can see that these are some examples of surrealist paintings. When you look at them, you can tell that reality has been distorted. Well, lo real maravilloso is different from surrealism because the base or the foundation of lo real maravilloso is a cultural belief system. And Alejo Carpentier learned about this when he went to Haiti, as he was trying to understand the Black reality. He decided to go to Haiti to understand the history, the rich history that African spirituality played in making Haiti the first independent nation or first independent colonized nation in the hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere. And when he was there, he notes that he saw lo real maravilloso in every step that he took because of the famous names and places such as the Fountain of Youth, the city of Manoa, heroes, mythological heroes, such as Juana de Azurdi, who was a female that was able to amass a group to fight against Spanish colonizers, or French colonizers, sorry. Now, one of the major examples that he uses is Macandal. Macandal was an African enslaved man who was a spiritual leader, and he was able to unify the community in rituals, Vodun rituals, and as a result, it played a part in helping to defeat the French army. And in the novel itself, there's a quote that focuses on Macandal's ability to transform into insects and animals. And this is done with the belief system that African ritual and practices are able to convert one's physical form. And he says that the lo real maravilloso, it starts to be what it is when reality is interrupted. The habitual action is interrupted by something that is different. But the individual is not shocked because they accept it because it's part of their belief system. A good example would be if a person is severely ill and they go to a healer, sometimes they get better, and that's because they have a faith that that healer can help them. And he says a really interesting quote, pero ¿qué es la historia de América? Toda sino una crónica de lo real maravilloso. What is American history? It's nothing more than a chronicle of lo real maravilloso. Now, the second area that I look at is orality and the role that orality plays in these novels, and focus on the nomo, or the word. In African culture, orality is very important. During slavery, orality was important because some enslaved individuals were not able to read or write. They were only able to remember their history through oral messages, things that were told to them by a griot or a wise leader. And nomo is the idea that words have power. And one important word that I implement in this title itself is ashe. Ashe is a concept that there is energy. Energy in items like animism, a rock, a flower, a plant, but also ashe, it means power. And Muntú is a word that appears in Manuel Zapata Oliveira's novel Chango a Gran Putas. I'm going to move a little bit faster to get to Richard Jackson. He attacks Alejo Carpentier. And he says Carpentier, like many of the Negrista poets, viewed Blacks with the detached perspective of the inquisitive phenomenalist. And that is definitely the case with Carpentier's first novel. But in his second novel, I argue that we see a transformation in which he has a deep love for Black culture, because he understands that he didn't have that love the first time. Richard Jackson also says the aesthetic vision of the prose of the early Carpentier, like that of the poetry of white Negrista poets of the Afro-Criollo movement, was a primitivist vision, even when used to find something of value in Black culture. So Carpentier, you can legitimately say that he had that Negrista superficial perspective toward Black identity, but I think that he redeemed himself with his next novel, El Reino de este Mundo. Now, I'm going to stop and focus on the oral tradition in the novels that I'm studying. In El Reino de este Mundo, one of the characters is Tinoel, and Tinoel is a protege of Macandal. And Tinoel tells stories to the children in the community of Africa, stories of Macandal and his magical powers. And through this oral transmission of stories, the later generation is able to know their history. In Quince Duncan's La Paz del Pueblo, there's reference to El Hermano Tucumá y El Hermano Araña. Brother Turtle and Brother Spider. And this has come from African folk tales that adults tell to their children. And the fact that the writer includes this in the novel, it's the way to let us remember how enslaved men and women were able to teach their children how to survive when you're in a situation where you might be small and fragile like a spider, but you learn to be cunning to be able to survive. In Cubanas of Carlos Guillermo Wilson, his nickname is Cubana, in his novel Los Nietos de Felicidad Dolores becomes a griot figure because she tells stories to her children, 3 children, each one representing a different community. One daughter is French speaking, one daughter Spanish speaking, one daughter English speaking. And Felicidad Dolores tells them stories as a way to help them to learn to accept each other and recognize their shared struggles. And in Chango el Gran Putas by Manuel Zapata Oliveira, there are numerous examples of figures from the past that appear to give guidance to the living. Orality is an important concept. Now, Manuel Zapata Oliveira is an amazing writer, and he was inspired by Alejo Carpentier. And Manuel Zapata Oliveira inspired other writers to begin to focus on African identity. One of the quotes in Chango el Gran Putas is el hombre que no cree en los misterios es una linterna apagada. The man that does not believe in mysteries is like a lamp with no flame. Now, in Chango el Gran Putas, he also, and I guess I should point out that Chango el Gran Putas is a history. It's a large book that about 600 pages that he spent 20 years researching, in which he documents the history of Black oppression in the Americas, in the United States, in Brazil, in Colombia, in the Caribbean. And he taps into talking about Macandal again. Now, all the works that I look at, they look at animism, which is a belief that everything has a divine energy in it. And Ashe is a divine form of energy. Ashe is very hard to explain, but when you are with another person and you feel a tight connection, that's Ashe. And I feel like it's important to point out that within, this is an example of Santeria. There's a concept of a divine father, creator, Olodumare. Then there's Olofi, which is kind of like the Holy Spirit. Oh no, Olofi is like Jesus on earth, and Olorun is the Holy Spirit. So we see these three levels. So a lot of people say, well, African spirituality, it's demonic. It's not. It's a faith structure. It's different, but it's not bad. And in the novels that I look at, we will find that one or more different spiritual traditions in the Americas appear. Regla de Ocha, which is known more commonly as Santeria, that grew out of Cuba. It has rituals and practices, symbolic colors and numbers, musical rhythms. Those are all embedded in these novels in different ways. There's La Regla Arara, which is a different faith tradition also that grew out of Cuba. La Sociedad Secreta de Abacua, los Ñáñigos. That's a secret society, male-dominated, which appears especially in the work of Alejo Carpentier. And Palo Monte, also known as Palo Mayombe, which is an earth-based practice using trees and plants. All of these faith traditions, plus one more, which is actually not even African, Espiritismo, Spiritism, which came from a French priest, ex-priest named Allan Kardec, which has become an important element within Afro-Cuban, well, I'll say Afro-Caribbean spirituality. Now, there are 7 major deities. They're called the 7 powers, las siete potencias. And the one that's very principal is Chango. Chango el Gran Putas. Chango is a warrior. And in times of struggle, some protagonists, for example, in Chango el Gran Putas, protagonists turn to Chango and let Chango fight his battles. Chango's colors are red and his number is 6. And there's syncretism, in which we see this merger of Christianity and African spirituality, because Chango is the Afro-Cuban manifestation of Santa Barbara or Saint Barbara. So while it appeared that slaves were worshiping or praying to Saint Barbara, they were really praying to Chango. And the other Orisha that appears in these works, and appears in some more than others, is Elegua, which is a deity that appears as a little child, a little boy. And he's mischievous. He can do great things, but like a little child, he's mischievous. He loves sweets. His colors are red and black. And in Christianity, he is seen as the child of Atocha, or also Saint Anthony. And Elegua, his day is Monday. Now, what happens is, as individuals start to understand these parts of Afro-Caribbean spirituality, then numbers and novels play an important role. Numbers and colors. For example, the color blue is associated with Yemaya, the goddess of fertility, the divine earth mother. And in the novel Los Nietos de Felicidad Dolores, her color is blue. There's references to her wearing blue all the time, and her using water from the ocean as a way to clean herself. Now, the last Orisha that I want to talk about is one which is Obatala, which is like one of the older Orishas. Wisdom, patience, and his color is white, his number is 8, and his Christian parallel would be the Mother of Mercy. Now, what I want to do is answer a key question in the book, and I hope that you have a chance to purchase it. And that is, why is Ashe Caribbean literary aesthetic so important? Well, what I argue is it's important because it allows readers to understand that African spirituality has played a major part in helping men, enslaved men and women, to survive hostile, violent situations. And the fact that these writers were courageous enough to acknowledge them in their writing by putting something down, by writing and acknowledging a topic on paper, you legitimize it. And these four writers that I have been talking about have done an incredible job of helping us to understand that we need to embrace all parts of ourselves. How we look, what we think, and the spiritual history that our ancestors practiced. So I want to thank you for being with me, and I want to kind of open it up now for questions and reactions. I want to thank you all for taking the time to join.
Thank you very much, Dr. Edison. It was very informative. Muchas gracias,
De
Dr.
nada.
Edison. Era una conferência muito pertinente. O palestrante deu uma fala muito interessante. Ce fut une présentation très intéressante. It's time for question and answer, but before that, I want to acknowledge here, like again, our Director of Public Relations, Dr. Paulo Dutra, again, was here to help, and is always doing a fantastic job.
Thank you.
And also among the public, we have Carolina Baez. Carolina, que es secretaria de Muntú, Hola, espero que todo esté bien ahí. So for everybody, pour tout le monde, para todo mundo, you can put the question there in Spanish or in English. In Portuguese also, for Portuguese, Dr. Dutra can translate for him in English. I can do that also. But you can put your question. So, Dr. Dutra, do you see any question?
Yes, sir. There is one question. You
Okay.
want me to go ahead and start with that?
Yes, can you upload it for him?
Yes. The question is in Spanish. ¿Ha resistido la espiritualidad africana frente a la cultura religiosa local y las contribuciones religiosas de la colonización?
Bueno, yo creo que es una pregunta más, ¿debo contestar en inglés o español?
Lo que tú quieras.
Bueno, he notado, yo vivo en Kentucky, el estado de Kentucky está en una región muy tradicional y conservadora. Y he notado que muchas veces cuando hablo sobre mi investigación, hay personas que tienen un tipo de rechazo porque ellos creen que una persona educada no debe enfocar tiempo en un tema que no es importante. Pero yo comprendo que ellos tienen una mentalidad que los elementos cristianos son superiores que los demás. Y he aprendido que no debo discutir con una persona con una mentalidad así, porque una creencia de una persona es su propia experiencia y no hay uno que es mejor ni peor. Pero no me meto en discusiones sobre eso porque eso no me va a ayudar a mí ni a ellos. No sé si he contestado bien la pregunta o no.
Gracias por la respuesta. Siempre son pistas, ¿no? De reflexión.
Sí.
Doctor Dutra, ¿hay más preguntas?
No.
No.
Todavía no.
Tengo primero que decir gracias a todos los que vinieron. Thank you for those who came. Merci pour ceux qui sont venus participer à ce séminaire. En tout cas, par leur présence. Obrigado para as pessoas que vieram aqui. Dr. Edison, there are so many to say about African religion in Latin America, right? And in the although I include some part of the Caribbean, Latin America, but there is over there a debate, right, about Caribbean, maybe Anglophone Caribbean, Francophone Caribbean, Spanish Caribbean. But one form of resistance. Can you give one example of resistance through, for instance, Santeria, or that mean African religion in Cuba, and another form of resistance through Candomblé, that is another African-based religion in Brazil? Can you give some example of resistance through these religions, African religions?
Well, I can say that those in Manuel Zapata Oliveira's book, Chango Gran Putas, he focuses on a great Afro-Brazilian folk leader, and I cannot remember the name right now, but he focuses on that leader and how he was able to free oppressed people. If we look in the Caribbean, like we talk about Macandal, Boukman in Cuba, in every country, people can come up with names of leaders that were able to lead revolts, and it was based off of some type of spiritual foundation. Now, in the United States, it's different. Here, it was Christian principles, but that's still spiritual. I think that even in Colombia, there's examples. I cannot remember the names now, but they are significant leaders that were able to use spiritual principles to merge people together to make them struggle for change.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Dr. Dutra, questions?
No, sir.
Comments? No?
No.
No. Dr. Dutra, yourself, do you have a question?
Me? I do,
Yeah.
actually.
Okay.
I do.
Okay.
Dr. Thomas, you mentioned that magical realism is a European concept. And then I think, if I'm not mistaken, you connected to surrealism. If you could please, how do you say in English, elaborate on that notion of magical realism being a European or Eurocentric concept, I would appreciate. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question, Paulo. When Alejo Carpentier was in Europe, he was part of this group that was led by André Breton, and they were surrealist, because that was the mode then of looking at reality and creating this reality that, well, it was a reality that was distortion of what truly exists. And what Alejo Carpentier discovered is that in America, and when we're talking about America, we're talking about Cuba. For him, in Cuba, there's no need to spend a lot of energy creating magical places and magical concepts, because due to the rich Afro-Caribbean elements, there's things that exist that people couldn't even believe of. And one good example is, I'm a gardener, and there's a plant called dormilona. It's a plant that when you touch it, it just claps. And it's magical. You touch it, it just looks like it dies, and then 20 minutes later, it perks back up again. That is something that is magic. It already is built on a principle, so you don't have to make it up. So what Carpentier decided is, one, when we look at magical realism, that's European. They manufactured that. Lo Real Maravilloso is built on something that is real and already exists. But in order for people to be able to appreciate it, they have to have a belief system. So that's how, and it's very complicated, because I'll read text and I'll notice that some people will call everything magical realism. But I want to stay true to Alejo Carpentier and how he explained how Lo Real Maravilloso is different from magical realism. And one other thing that I didn't tap into much is a lot of researchers, especially early on in the 1980s, a lot of them rejected Alejo Carpentier just because he was a white Cuban, without really looking at the quality of his work. And I think that one important thing that we need to acknowledge is that Alejo Carpentier put a lot of work into trying to redeem himself. And I think that when we look at the authenticity question, I think that it's very difficult for a person who is not part of a culture to represent that culture. It's very difficult. But I think that for someone to try to do it, especially if they do it because they love that culture and they have respect for that culture, that we need to acknowledge them for their contribution.
Thank you very much for your answer. Paulo, do we have a comment question?
No, sir.
Okay.
Just congratulations. And
okay, thank you.
Like.
Dr. Edison, I'm coming back again for for a comment followed by a question. There is a big debate today in Africa, and among these debates, there is the importance of Muntú, right? Like how we can regain and reappropriate our identity and our epistemologies, right? And talking about African religion and as a culture of resistance from Latin America is very interesting, but is at the same time very disturbing, right? Because in Africa, the practice of the African religion is private, because the public practice of religion is through the European legacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So do you think there is a way, like we can, African descent in the America can participate at least on this rebuilding the pride of practicing the African religion in the continent?
In the continent. Well,
Yes.
It is starting to happen that individuals are starting to and this is it's interesting. In communities, big metropolitan communities, for example, New York and Miami, Afro-Caribbean spirituality is becoming accepted. One of the reasons is because white individuals are beginning to see the power that faith offers them. And this is one of the sad things is we go through a cycle in which we are taught to reject parts of ourselves. For example, we reject dances, we reject certain food until white culture decides it is good. And then, like, for example, tango. A lot of people don't know that tango is a Black dance. And if you tell people, you're dancing a Black dance, they'll go, no, it's a European dance. It was actually African, went to Europe, came back, and now it's been accepted, but they've erased the Blackness from it. So with Afro-Caribbean spirituality, and you're right, it is very private, very secret, because most people have endured a lot of shame and pain and attacks, political, social attacks. And I think that now, because we're in a different world, people are starting to recognize that the walls are coming down. I think now, again, I am in the Bible Belt. The wall doesn't come down much here. When I was in DC, I noticed that there was a lot more openness, and you would see people wearing their necklaces, and here that doesn't happen. But the nice thing is there's writers that are helping those people to see, that reaching out to say, it's okay, you're not by yourself.
Thank you very much. Paulo, I think there is a comment, right? Or question?
No, there is no question.
Okay. Yes.
I can ask a question.
Yes, of course.
Going back to one of the questions that was asked here, like resistance, resisting the influence of the European religion. But what about and here I'm talking about religion in a very broad sense. What about the local religions, like the indigenous religions, if I may say, in all this process of, because I think in Brazil, there are also elements of the, again, I'm going to use this expression, indigenous religions in what we call today Afro-Brazilian religions. Mm-hmm. So maybe if you could talk about the influence of the impact of the relationship, if any, between African spirituality and indigenous spirituality.
That's really interesting, and it's very deep, because when we look at religion. And when I say religion, I am talking about European descended faith practices. There's usually a very strict dogma and belief system, and it rejects anything that is different from what is established. Well, with Afro-Caribbean or African descended faith traditions, there's an openness. So, for example, in Brazil, with Candomblé, there's elements of indigenous practices and they're integrated. There's not a wall that says, no, you can't do this. And just as much as in Candomblé, we find Christian elements. In Santeria, we find Christian elements. We find images, candles, the use of incense, the use of the Bible. Those Christian elements play just as much a part as the indigenous elements. When we look at, now we can't say that with Cuba because there wasn't a lot of indigenous community left. But we can say that, for example, in Puerto Rico and in Haiti, we can see that there are some indigenous practices that were incorporated into it. What's difficult is to always be able to trace it back and say, okay, this is indigenous. It's easy to find out what's African. It's easy to find out what is European. I think it's harder to find out what is indigenous because those groups kind of were erased to a certain extent. But I would suspect that a good research project would be to look at indigenous elements in Brazilian spirituality and in Puerto Rican spirituality.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. I think what you're saying is it works. I can start with Ubanda, for instance. The Ubanda integrate all these three, and in the Ubanda, people going to, because in Brazil, these temples are called centros. So in this, I went there. Both I went to Candomblé and I went to Ubanda. In Candomblé, now they're trying to even hide more and more the Africanness of the Candomblé. You see more the saint, the Christian saint, and even sometimes, you know, now we are in the new technology. So in the big screen, that we put more image of the Catholicism. And of course, all the people are African descent, but you can see like there is a double message, right? For one hand, they're trying to show the Africanness, and for the other hand, they're trying to wipe it, like it's in Brazil, tratam de apagar. They're trying to eliminate the Africanness. They do certainly to the pressure, for the political pressure, I think social pressure, etc., etc. And now it's even more complicated for Brazilian because the Baptist church are coming a lot in Brazil. So these centros, this Candomblé and Ubanda, I will say that they're becoming less and less African in the representation, right? They exist like an African origin religion, but in the representation, they're trying to be less and less. This is due also to the presence of as they call him in Brazil, Bolsonaro, right? Bolsonaro has been a lot against this kind of representation of Africanness.
Cursing is not allowed here.
Yeah. And you know, one of the interesting things is that even in African descended faith practices, there is a phenomenon that is existing, and because we're talking about legitimizing, showing African spirituality as something that's significant and valuable and beautiful, but there are some individuals that are using it to manipulate others. just like we see this in Christianity too. In, like, for example, Santeria, there's some places where they will take your money, but there is no, it's not legitimate. And it's really sad because it brings down, it helps other people to say, "I'll see that there's nothing to that. Don't be brainwashed. Don't be fooled." And I think that it's becoming a market for some people. Becoming a santero or santera or padrino is a way that you're to make money off of other people's pain and misery. And that's something that's really sad, but I think that's going to change as the faith pulls from being something secret to being something legitimate.
Thank you very much. Pablo, there is a comment question?
Yes, there is 2 questions.
Okay.
There are 2 questions, I guess. I'll put the first one is from Carolina. ¿Cómo podríamos trabajar el tema de las espiritualidades desde una academia colonizada?
Oh, buena pregunta. En los Estados Unidos hay organizaciones como the College Language Association, Palara, here with Muntú. Hay que encontrar lugares, círculos de intelectuales que comprenden ese tema, donde podemos publicar y escribir sobre eso. Yo estoy en una universidad y acá yo no hago muchas presentaciones sobre el tema porque yo sé que el público mío está lejos de acá. Pero hay un público, hay un lugar donde hay personas que quieren saber de eso y organizaciones académicas en la academia es el camino que recomiendo. Oh, en Colombia. Oh, dijo que está en Colombia.
Sí. Y Carolina es la secretaria de Muntú también. Y al respecto a la academia colonizada, precisamente lo que yo quiero añadir a lo que acaba de decir, lo que quisiera decir a Carolina es que precisamente estamos aquí dentro de este tipo de grupo interdisciplinario como Muntú para descolonizar la academia. Y cómo descolonizar la academia es a través de nuestros acercamientos. O sea que si queremos hablar, por ejemplo, de la religión y entramos en una clase y empezamos diciendo la religión católica, la religión protestante, y no decimos ni una palabra de la santería, de candomblé, de Shango en Colombia o en Trinidad, ni de otras religiones. En África había, por ejemplo, en Costa de Marfil, un proceso. Bueno, existen ya religiones en privado, ¿no? La religión africana existe, o sea, la gente la practica en privado, pero había un proceso de legitimación científica. Trató un filósofo de Costa de Marfil que se llama Jean-Marie Diafi, y él estaba tratando de montar algo llamado el bosonismo, ¿no? A la manera de la santería o del candomblé. Y, por ejemplo, cuando un profesor entra en la clase y es profesor de historia de la religión o de filosofía de la religión, tiene que hablar de eso. Así se descoloniza. Simplemente. Y cuando la gente habla de vudú y uno es profesor en una universidad, no tiene que ir corriendo. Tiene que decir que vudú precedió a la teología de la liberación en América Latina, que el vudú es un centro principal de la liberación de los haitianos. Hay que decirlo, así se descoloniza. Pero si se repite que el vudú viene del demonio, nunca se va a descolonizar. Sí. O sea, ahí está la cuestión. Primero, tomar conciencia de sí y de sus valores, ¿no? Y a partir de ahí, tomar conciencia de que estamos ahí para transformar, no para reproducir. Ahí está el punto, ¿no? Central. Transformar, descolonizar, no reproducir. O sea, todo este esquema occidental o occidentalizado, ¿no? Y ahí está la descolonización. ¿Hay más preguntas?
Sí, pero why are you hiding? We want to see you.
Oh, no, excuse me. I did not notice I was old.
I thought that was the question. Like, why are you?
You should have said that before.
I missed you. Okay, we all missed you.
You
That
should have
is
said that before.
nah. You're the president. I cannot tell you what to do. You tell me what to do. So there is one more question. ¿Podríamos considerar con Manuel Zapata su chango como un sincretismo renovado?
Sí. Oh, bueno, yo fui a una ponencia que pusieron para Manuel Zapata Olivella hace 3 años y fue increíble. Y descubrí que él sufrió mucho porque no recibió mucho apoyo del gobierno por ser negro. Y cuando salió su novela Chango el Gran Putas, había un rechazo de muchas personas. Algunas personas tuvieron problemas con el título del libro. Y en la ponencia había un pastor y él estaba quejándose sobre el título de la novela. Pero yo creo que Manuel Zapata Olivella fue un ser increíble porque él estableció una conexión entre el Muntú, entre todos nosotros que somos de África. Y en la novela, él refleja que nosotros todos hemos tenido que luchar y tenemos que luchar para representar, para ser quien somos. Y la pregunta me hace pensar en el funeral. En YouTube pueden buscar el funeral de Manuel Zapata Olivella. Y fue increíble porque había un pastor católico y a su lado había una mujer que practicaba una religión africana, yo no sé cuál, pero y habían otras personas, yo sospecho, de otros grupos como de santería, de vodú, de candomblé. Es bonito ver un funeral con tanta representación porque él fue una persona con tantas perspectivas, tantos lados que no podía tener un funeral y solamente representar una religión.
¿Hay más preguntas?
No, señor presidente.
Muy bien. Bueno, Tomás, hablaste de un tema también importante ahora, ¿no? Que está haciendo un debate aquí en Estados Unidos, el debate de la afrocentricidad. Hay presiones políticas para que no se hable de la afrocentricidad en las universidades y todo. ¿Qué opinas tú de estos conceptos de la afrocentricidad, por ejemplo, como lo dice Molefi Ashanti Afrocentricity, y hablaste de Richard Jackson, que habla también de authenticity? ¿Qué piensas de esos conceptos, ¿no? teóricos para los sujetos africanos?
Yo creo que es importante, como mencionaste, es importante que nosotros hablemos de esas cosas. En mis clases, yo voy a dar un curso el semestre que viene y eso va a ser una introducción a la literatura afrocaribeña. Y al principio del semestre hay estudiantes blancos que no se sienten cómodos en describir una protagonista negra. Porque aquí en los Estados Unidos hemos aprendido a ser colorblind, en que no vemos la raza, pero es una tontería, porque podemos ver y debemos decir, es un hombre negro, ¿no? No es una cosa negativa, pero el hecho de que muchas personas han aceptado que ser negro es algo negativo, por esa razón no lo voy a decirlo. Si una persona es negra, la persona es negra. Yo creo que tenemos que hablar y yo creo que la cosa clave es en la academia, ¿no? Nosotros que tenemos posiciones de autoridad necesitan abrir caminos para los demás, porque hay otros que quieren ofrecer una perspectiva fresca, pero las instituciones están organizadas filtrar para permitir que solamente voces especiales pueden hablar. Pero la realidad es todos debemos poder hablar.
Gracias, gracias. ¿Más preguntas, Pablo?
No, señor.
Bueno, Tomás, yo no sé si quisieras añadir algo, porque ya como no hay más preguntas.
Yo quiero decirles gracias por darme la oportunidad de compartir mis ideas y el libro está acá y lo pueden, si ustedes me manden un correo electrónico, les puedo conseguir el libro a un descuento. Eso es
muy bien.
El descuento de Muntú.
¿Puedes recordar el título de tu libro, por favor?
Sí, es The Afro-Caribbean Literary Aesthetic in the Cuban, Colombian, Costa Rican, and Panamanian Novel of Resistance.
Muy bien. Gracias. ¿Puedes compartir el email, Pablo, en la pantalla o no? El email de él.
I'm looking for it. I'll do it.
Bien. Merci à tous. N'oubliez pas d'envoyer vos propositions pour le séminaire international Muntú. Et les propositions peuvent être de tous ordres, hein, dans toutes les disciplines. Dans toutes les disciplines, économie, politique, histoire, médecine, hein, droit, langue africaine, etc. Entonces, sí, no hay que olvidar enviar sus propuestas para los seminarios de Muntú y en todas las disciplinas, ¿no? De saber, economía, historia, ciencias políticas, derechos, medicina, por ejemplo, cómo evaluar la medicina a la luz del aporte africano, ¿no? Por ejemplo. Não esqueçam enviar suas propostas para os seminários Muntú. Vocês podem enviar nos todos os campos do saber, economia, política, direito, história, etc., etc. Please send your proposal for the seminar, International Seminar of Muntú. All fields are accepted. Economics, mathematics, social science in general, history, medical field, law, political science, etc., etc. Please feel free to send that in all the language you feel comfortable with. Without any further ado, if Paulo does not have anything to say, no?
Just remind everyone to subscribe to the channel.
Oh, yeah, it's true.
The word, so more people are able to enjoy the
yes, it's true.
The talks.
Souscrivez à la chaîne YouTube donc et partagez, likez, comme on dit. Inscríbase no canal YouTube et compartilhem, por favor. Voilà, partagez donc et por favor que compartan los el sitio, el canal YouTube de Muntú, que se inscriban también y que hagan conocer al canal, por favor. La supervivencia de Muntú, virtualmente, por lo menos virtualmente, depende de eso también. Muy bien. Así todo, nos decimos hasta el año próximo. Feliz año nuevo y feliz Navidad. Bye bye. Chao, chao.